Welcome to this new podcast produced by the Institute for European Environmental Policy. My name is Gabrielle Aubert. I'm working as a policy analyst in the biodiversity team. As a not-for-profit organization with over 45 years of experience, IEEP is advancing impact-driven sustainability policy across the EU and the world. Today, I am joined by Nigel Dudley, co-founder of Equilibrium Research and IEEP Associates, to talk about COP16 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the first COP since the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework at COP15 in 2022, a landmark agreement for global biodiversity conservation. We have a lot to cover today, so let's dive in. Welcome, Nigel, and thank you very much for joining us today. As a first question, I wanted to ask you, why is COP16 such an important milestone for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework? And what will be the critical issues in the negotiations at the COP?
Thanks, Gabrielle. Well, normally a conference of parties, a COP, immediately after a big decision would be very much a stock-taking exercise. And it would be a chance for governments to look at what decisions they'd made. But one of the real challenges for the whole global biodiversity framework is that because of the pandemic and because of the challenges of agreeing it, the timetable was already well underway. So this is important because it can't just be a stock taking and a talking about how things are developing. It's going to need to be reporting real progress. I'm sure you know that the whole process was quite controversial. It took a long time to agree. Back in Montreal in 2022, when the decision was coming, those of us in the room never really expected it until the last few days to even be agreed. There seemed to be such a difference between the parties every time they met, that the positions were being held, there wasn't any progress. And suddenly it all came together really last few minutes. And China actually banged the table and agreed the process before the whole translation process had continued. So half the room didn't know what the Chinese had said before they said, right, it's all agreed. So it was very tight. Then there was disagreements. There've been changes, slight changes, but important changes, even after the final decision. So it's going to be important because it was a tough decision, very controversial, big ambitions, and this is the first chance to talk about it since then. I think the main area will be keeping things on track. And then there's a number of issues that have come up which are going to be particularly important. Probably what everyone's going to be looking at most carefully is the indicators. In the IEEP targets, the targets that came before the Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, the IEEP targets, the targets that were successful were the ones that had something concrete for governments to measure against. The targets that really failed partly because governments didn't really know how to measure them. IEEP 11, which was the target to reach 17% of land and 10% of marine in protected areas, was protected and conserved areas, was one of the most successful in terms of those area targets were almost met because they were something that could be measured in part. Now, there were dangers in there because lots of the other elements within that target tended to be ignored, things like equity, things like governance. So there's a danger in having a hard target, but it did mean at least there was progress. In other ones, there wasn't. And one of the worrying things at the moment is that we still don't know many of the indicators. The indicators are still very vague for some of the targets. Other things that are coming up, if you look at the SBSTA meeting, the meeting of the technical body, there's two ad hoc committees, one on risk assessment, one on synthetic biology. Synthetic biology is going to be very controversial again. IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, spent years trying to agree a position on synthetic biology and abandoned the attempt. It was too controversial. So this is going to be tough. There's quite a lot of work on gaps. There's an identification of 40 gaps in marine research, for example, the information which scientists think we need in order to put some of the marine elements of the global biodiversity framework into place. There's work on genetically modified organisms. There's work on the EBSAs, the sea areas that are identified as being important. So there's going to be a lot of things on the agenda. And then I guess the real elephant in the room, the thing that people are going to be most worried about is finance. And finance is what almost sunk the global biodiversity framework right throughout the process. Even after China had agreed it, the Democratic Republic of Congo disagreed, which means, in theory, the whole agreement falls apart. There was some very tense 24 hours of negotiation after that process, looking at that. And eventually DRC agreed to have some wording saying it wasn't happy about that, but agreed for the GBF to be signed. So that's going to be incredibly important.
Thank you very much for that very detailed answer. As a second question, I wanted to ask you, where have we seen progress in global biodiversity framework implementation, and where has progress stalled so far?
You know, Gabrielle, it's going to be quite difficult to answer that until after the meeting, because many of the issues are going to be reported there. In Target 3, which is the one that everyone's really interested in, which is the target to create protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, often used protected and conserved areas in 30% of land and freshwater and 30% of ocean. That is progressing. We know that. The Protected Planet report from the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center tracks progress. Is going to be published. They've seen an increase in protected areas and a big increase in OECMs. The fact there's any increase in protected areas is quite encouraging, because many governments felt they'd already got enough land in protected areas. It wasn't really expected to see much progress, but there has still been progress. Other effective area-based conservation measures, which were agreed as a concept back in 2020 in the Aichi targets, but not really brought into the Convention on Biological Diversity until 2018. It took 8 years to agree exactly what that concept OECM meant in practice. They've increased very rapidly, and many countries are looking at what areas could be set aside, looking at where they could recognize them. I think there's about 7,000 now, which is a great distortion of reality, because Sweden abruptly identified 6,000 very recently, and they're small forest areas, and we don't even know really what that means yet, but there's probably about 1,000 that have been identified. And OECMs, to remind you, are areas that provide effective biodiversity conservation, even if they're not aimed at that. So it can be a very wide range of different things. It can be military training grounds. That was the first one that was recognized. Often, you know, there's people training there, maybe shooting over there, but it's often on wild land that is quite good for wildlife. But then also territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. They could be areas of marine set aside for whatever other purpose, watershed protection areas on land. Those areas, as I say, they are increasing. And more importantly, many governments are looking at what they mean in their own circumstances. Many of the other issues, though, it's very difficult to measure progress. And one of the challenges is to even measure progress. And there's been a lot of work over the last 12 months, 2 years in looking at indicators, as I mentioned earlier. There's a 300+ page document going in enumerating what has happened in terms of agreement of indicators. But when you read that in detail, it's often very, very general. So for the broader aspirational targets relating to consumption, to gender parity, to bringing companies into working on environment, it's still really a report back from governments about whether they think progress has been made. There's very little concrete to measure still. So that's quite worrying. And I think, as I said earlier, if we don't get that right, it's going to be difficult to measure back in 2030 whether we have made any progress or not. And it's also difficult for governments to identify concrete actions. When the fifth Global Biodiversity Outlook was published, there were whole targets under HE where the Commission on Biological Diversity, the Secretariat, just had to say, we don't quite know what's happened here. And we really want to avoid that this time. It's not clear yet whether that's been made. So I think there has been some progress in the things we can measure. We'll know much more after we have the meeting in Cali, but some of the things remain fairly uncertain. You know, if we take the European Union, where we probably have better data than most parts of the world, some things have moved forward very, very fast, but some things have stalled and gone backwards.
Great, thank you so much for that detailed answer. You just mentioned the European Union, and I'd like to look at this regional perspective now. Given the recent EU vote to downgrade the wolves protection status and the delay on the deforestation rules, do you think that the EU is backtracking on things it promised in the lead up to COP16?
Yes and no. The EU is still in many ways leading the way, and we've got to praise that because I think it's holding a line. I take an example from my own country. I'm in the UK. After Brexit, our environmental protection has slipped back very quickly from many of the things that are still legally obligatory within the European Union, on terms of things like pesticide safety and many other issues. So the EU is still holding the line. There's a number of caveats to that. I mean, the wolf downgrading was disappointing, but it's also, I guess we probably will have to control wolf numbers eventually in Europe. What we have seen is a great increase, very exciting increase. You couldn't have imagined 20 or 30 years ago that we'd have wolves spreading out in the way they have done. I remember talking with people in Switzerland, the guy who had the job of trying to monitor or encourage wolf reintroduction in Switzerland back in the 1990s, and it felt like a completely impossible task. Those things have been done. There is going to be a certain amount of kickback. Bear hunting in Sweden is an even more depressing example, in a way, where the number of bears being shot is increased radically. I think the deforestation rules, again, it's very disappointing, because deforestation was something that was identified as being incredibly important way back when, in the 1970s, 1980s, when these issues were first being talked about, when WWF and partners did the first World Conservation Strategy. Deforestation was up there as a key issue, and actually it's increasing, if anything. The rate is going up. So it's a huge failure, one of the huge failures of the environmental movement. And this seemed to be a concrete step to try and address that, because we have sorted this out in Europe, in not in North America, but in Europe. We haven't in the tropics, and that's also where the bulk of the biodiversity is. I think a lot of the kickback has come from tropical countries, and they said it's difficult for us to identify what is real deforestation. So they're saying, look, it's difficult for us to measure real deforestation. To some extent, that's a smokescreen. They're also relying in many cases on exports, and they're still trying to clear land for agriculture. But it's disappointing. I hope that will be sorted out. I hope that is just a delay and not a kickback. I think what's more worrying is that there has been a general reactionary move against environment, whether or not the European Union are going to be able to address things like the very ambitious, but I think very necessary targets about reducing the impact of pesticides, reducing the impact of fertilizers. It's going to be much more difficult. And I expect to see some backsliding there. And that's a real problem. It's also going to create a real split within the continent, because a lot of people do care deeply about wildlife, but also the health impacts of particularly pesticides are coming out and being much more quantified. Used to be even quite difficult a few years ago to get a paper published on this kind of material. There was such a tight control on the information, but we're seeing more and more data coming out. I think there's going to be there's going to be a very interesting and probably very tense debate between the farming lobby feeling very under threat and stressed, and maybe civil society increasingly looking for greater controls. How that plays out in the European Union, I'm not sure.
I'd like to move now to finance, because you've mentioned it's a really important aspect of the global biodiversity framework. And so we know that the global biodiversity framework has very ambitious financing targets. And recently we've been talking a lot more about biodiversity credits and certificates. We've seen this growing focus, and I wanted to ask you, why do you think there's been such a recent interest in these biodiversity or nature credits? And how effective could they be in driving positive biodiversity outcomes and financing flows?
Okay, so I'm gonna start by just reading a proposed definition of a biodiversity credit. Biodiversity credit is a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what would otherwise have occurred. This is something that industry has been asking for a long time. We've had steps towards this for 30 years now. Something like the Forest Stewardship Council, which provides concrete standards for forest companies to abide by if they want to get an FSC logo. That came in I think 1993, but that doesn't give the industry any guarantee that what they do makes a positive difference. And there's been and there's now a whole range of different standards. It's aquaculture stewardship standards, marine stewardship standards, standards for beef, for biofuels. It's been a very impressive growth. It doesn't give much hard information about whether that's doing any good. And as I'm sure you know, particularly if we look at the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, as an example, there was a 10-15 year period in which different certification schemes battled for supremacy, and they very bitter debate, particularly within Europe, with one from the forest owners, and then the FSC from the conservation side, and lots of debate. But even after that, the FSC in effect became the dominant certification. There was still very little proof that it was doing any good, and there were plenty of people saying it wouldn't. And one of the challenges for industry trying to do the right thing is that there's always someone criticizing what you do. So there's been whole organizations set up to watch the FSC. On the one hand, that's very positive, but it's quite tough for anyone who's trying to use that system. Industry has been asking, as have major donors, as have the groups like the World Bank, been asking for some much more positive, concrete measure. And biodiversity credits are, seen maybe as that next step. And what they're focusing on, I think the important thing is outcomes. So a measure that biodiversity is either has been stabilized or ideally has increased, conditions for it have increased as a result of whatever action has been taken, and increased more than it would have done otherwise if no action had been taken. So it's looking for a positive measure. All those things are very, very difficult to measure. They're hard. And one of the challenges for industry is that to measure change in biodiversity is quite a slow process. If you look at, if you change management within a forest, you'll see some things happen very quickly, but other things will take much longer, will be measured over decades rather than over years. So again, that's very difficult. It's going to be difficult to prove biodiversity credits, but that's the concept.
Great. Thank you very much, Nigel. This has been a great discussion, but unfortunately, this is all the time that we have today. Thank you very much, Nigel, for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us. And if you want to read more about the core policies linked to sustainability and biodiversity and our work at IEEP, please check our website at ieep.eu. Thank you very much.